This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, Baruchim Aboim. Welcome everyone. Thank you everybody for joining us tonight. We thank all of the live participants, Torah Anytime viewers. Tonight's Shiur, as all the Shiurim on Sofer Vayikra are sponsored by the Zakheim family. Leila Nishmas Reb Shlomo Eliezer ben Harav Yaakov Zakheim. I see someone from the Mishpacha is on the screen. Thank you very much. Shalom Shavan Aliyah. Shalom El Tzoshev Hol Mishpacha. Someone anonymously sponsored all the Shiurim. Leila Nishmas Harav Mordechai Lev ben Rav Yosef Menachem Glatstein, our grandfather. Tonight's Shiur is sponsored by Dr. Ze'ev Fanfeder in honor of his father's yahrzeit, which is today Gavriel ben Ze'ev, and as a hoida that Reb Zev had a refuah shalema, Reb Zev ben Rickel, he should have refuahs, shus nachamas, good health, ad bias gal tzedek, and also sponsored by the Klein family, Le'iloi nishmas Sarah bas Mordechai. Okay, that is the shiur for tonight. No, actually that was just the introduction. Okay, Baruchim Aboim, welcome everyone. Tonight we have a fantabulous subject, a very interesting topic. A controversy that happened about 170 years ago. Very interesting controversy. And it's based on a Gemara that we learned in Yevamos recently. And here we go. What's the connection to the Parsha? In the Parsha we have the mitzvah of bris milah, B'yom hashmini yimal besar arlasai. So we're going to speak about the role of bris milah in establishing someone as a Jew. We know in order to convert, when someone is born a Jew, all they need is milah. But if somebody is a Gentile and they want to become a Jew, then they need gerus. Now, what is gerus? There are three opinions in the Gemara in Yevamos on Daf Mem Vav Amud Aleph, going on to Mem Vav Amud Beis. The first opinion is the opinion of Rabbi Lezer. Rabbi Lezer says you need milah, and that's it. All you need is milah. You do not need tefillah. Rabbi Yeshua, on the other hand, holds. And Rabbi Lezer says, where do I learn it out from? I learned it out from Klal Yisrael. They left Mitzrayim. They entered into the Jewish fold with milah, and they never went to the mikvah. What mikvah did they go to? They had a mikvah in the midbar. They had a Vizhnitza mikvah. They had a Satmar mikvah in the midbar. What mikvah did they go to? There was no mikvah. So they had milah, there was no tefillah, and they were Jews. Rabbi Yeshua, on the other hand, says, tefillah without milah works. Just go to the mikvah. You want to become a Jew? Jump in the mikvah. It's interesting, no? All you need to do is jump in the mikvah, and you could become Jewish, according to Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Yeshua says, where do we learn this from? The imais, the mothers, how did they become Jewish? They didn't have a milah. They went to the mikvah. So too, anybody who jumps in the mikvah becomes Jewish. And Rabbi Yossi and the Chachamim, and this is how we paskin, say, if you look in Mem Vav Amud Beis, number 1 on your sheets, Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, La'olam eino ger ad shayimal v'yitbal. You're not a ger until you circumcise and immerse. Okay, and that's how we paskin. That one is not a ger until they go to the mikvah, and until they have circumcision and they go to the mikvah. Good, excellent. One needs milah and tefillah. Michael, you have a question, or it's just no audio, huh? You can't hear? Well, you can't hear? You can't hear. You can't hear. Could you hear now? Could you hear? Anyone raise your hand if you could hear? No one could hear. That's real. Okay, 1 second. Let's see if we can. Yeah. I don't know. You're not able to hear? No? Not at all? Not at all. How about on the live stream? I don't know. Okay, you'll have to come here, I guess. So, or you could just watch. Sorry. So that's the Gemara's conclusion. The Gemara's conclusion is in order to become a ger, you need milah and you need tefillah. Tefillah without milah, milah without tefillah is not a good gerus. That is the conclusion of the Gemara. Now, what? The order, yes, you have to do milah and then you do tefillah. Okay, so the Gemara, the Tosfos has the following shaila, and this is what the Shiur is based on. Tosfos' shaila is the Gemara in Ayin Aleph Amud Aleph says that Rabbi Akiva encounters the following pasuk: Toishav v'sachir lo yoichal bo. Someone who's a ger toishav, someone who is a sachir, he cannot eat the Karban Pesach. Says the Gemara, what is that coming to exclude? That's coming to exclude a ger shemol v'loy taval. A ger that had milah and did not have tefillah cannot eat from the Karban Pesach. Okay, we have a pasuk toishav v'sachar lo yochal bo, from which the Gemara derives that a ger that had milah without tefillah cannot eat from the Karban Pesach. Frek Tosfos, who is Rabbi Akiva going like? If he's going like Rabbi Eliezer, that milah without tefillah is a good gerus, then why in the world can you eat from the Karban Pesach? You're a full-fledged ger, you're a complete ger, you're a total ger. Why would the pasuk say you can't eat from the Karban Pesach? Well, because you don't have a tefillah. Tefillah doesn't do anything according to Rabbi Eliezer. Elamai, Rabbi Akiva holds like Rabbi Yossi, or like Rabbi Yeshua, that milah without tefillah doesn't work, is not a good gerus. So then, why do I need a pasuk that you can't eat from the Karban Pesach? You're a complete guy. You're not even kachavim. So Tosfos asks, Miman of Shach. Why would Rabbi Akiva need a pasuk that someone who has milah without tefillah cannot eat for the Karban Pesach? If you hold tefillah is necessary, so then of course you can't eat from the Karban Pesach. You're a guy. And if you hold tefillah is not necessary, so then why can you eat from the Karban Pesach? You're a full-fledged Jew. Miman of Shach. So Tosfos says, really, Rabbi Akiva holds like Rabbi Yeshua. And milah without tefillah is not a gerus. If milah without tefillah is not a gerus, so then why do I need a pasuk that you can't eat from the Karban Pesach? Of course you can't eat from the Karban Pesach. You're not Jewish. This is the pasuk from which you learn out that if you don't have mikvah, you're not Jewish. We learn it out from the Karban Pesach. In other words, from the fact that the Torah says if you have milah without tefillah, you can't eat from the Karban Pesach. Yeah, I don't know why there's no sound. From the fact that the pasuk says that if you have milah without tefillah, you can't eat from the Karban Pesach. From there, we learn out that you're not Jewish unless you have tefillah. This is the source. But again, let's get Tosfos' question clear. Tosfos' question is, we have a pasuk by Karban Pesach that someone who has a milah without immersing in the mikvah, you can't eat from the Karban Pesach. So Tosfos wants to know, according to the Chachamim, that you need tefillah to be Jewish, so then why do I need a pasuk that you can't eat from the Karban Pesach? Of course you can't eat from the Karban Pesach. And if we hold that milah without tefillah is a good gerus, then why can't you eat from the Karban Pesach? Comes the Rashba. The Rashba is really the main source of tonight's shiur. And the Rashba says, in Yevamos, Ayin Aleph Amud Aleph, says the Rashba, why does Rabbi Akiva say a ger that's circumcised and didn't go to the mikvah is not a ger until he goes to the mikvah? What do you mean? Of course, I don't need a pasuk that you can't eat from the Karban Pesach. You're not Jewish. In other words, why would Rabbi Akiva need a pasuk? You can't eat from the Karban Pesach. You don't have tefillah. Says the Rashba, tremendous chiddush. So the Rashba asks like this: do I need a pasuk? Let's say you had an Arab who had milah without any tefillah. Then would I need a pasuk that he can't eat from the Karban Pesach? Of course he can't eat from the Karban Pesach. He's not Jewish, right? So why would the pasuk be saying, excluding someone who has milah without tefillah? Someone who has milah without tefillah is not a yid. So the Rashba says there's a very big difference between a ger who has milah without tefillah and somebody who is, let's say, an Arab who has milah and doesn't have tefillah. The difference is, an Arab who has a milah without tefillah, he didn't do milah to be a Jew. So I don't need a pasuk to say that he can't eat from the Karban Pesach. However, someone, says the Rashba, who has milah without tefillah, so he did milah for to be a Jew. So says the Rashba the following chiddush. He says, "Deshani hacha de milasai l'shem yahadus ve'afal pi shaloi nigmar gerusai mikol makoim kvar hischel v'nichnas ktsas b'das Yehudis." Says the Rashba that when someone has milah, even without tefillah, even though he's not fully Jewish yet, but he already began the process of entering Judaism, so he's slightly Jewish, says the Rashba, nichnas kitsas bedas Yehudish she'eno tzarach ela tefillah. He's entered a little bit the Jewish fold, and all he needs is tefillah. In other words, the Rashba says the following chiddush: even though we paskin, if somebody does milah without tefillah, they are not Jewish. Nevertheless, they have entered the fold a little bit. They're quasi-Jewish, they're ktsas ger, and all they need is tefillah, and therefore you would have thought they could eat from the Karban Pesach, and therefore I need a pasuk to say they don't eat from the Karban Pesach. In other words, here's the Rashba's whopper of a chiddush. The Rashba comes along and he says that even though we paskin, that someone who does circumcision, and he doesn't do tefillah, is not a Jew, but he begins to enter the process just a little bit, and because of that, I would have thought he's allowed to eat from the Karban Pesach, and the pasuk says no, he doesn't eat from the Karban Pesach. Okay, so that's the chiddush of the Rashba, that milah does something. So based on this, we have the following historical account. In 1848, in the city of Yerushalayim, on the 23rd day of Adar Beis, a man converted to Judaism, and he had a milah. The only thing is, his milah was not healing. His milah was not being cured, and he couldn't go to the mikveh. The Gemara Yevamah says that if somebody's milah is still raw, you can't go to the mikveh. The mikveh will irritate the wound. So he didn't know what to do. So the natural choice would be to go to Reb Shmuel Salant and to try to have a shiloh. What should he do? He can't go to the mikvah. Now, so you say, okay, he'll wait until the wound heals. But the question is, what does he do about Shabbos? Because if he doesn't have a tefillah, he's not Jewish. If he's not Jewish, then he has to desecrate the Shabbos. Should he desecrate the Shabbos before he goes to the mikvah? So he goes to Reb Shmuel Salant. Reb Shmuel Salant was out of town. Shmuel Salant was going fundraising for some new initiatives. He had to raise money for a new yeshiva that he established in the courtyard of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, and he went to Russia to collect money. So who took over Reb Shmuel Salant? Reb Shmuel Salant had a backup rabbi for the weekend. So this ger goes to the backup rabbi. He says, I had milah, I didn't have tefillah, it's Shabbos, I'm not Jewish. Do I need to keep the Shabbos, or do I need to desecrate the Shabbos? So he said, you're going to have to desecrate the Shabbos. You're not Jewish. And he told him, after Mincha, I want you to take out a pen. You're going to write 2 letters. You have to be Mechal Shabbos. After all, Ger Sheshavas is Chayiv Misa. And that's what he did. This future Ger was Mechal Shabbos. The other rabbis in the area found out about the psaka of Rabbi Shmuel Salant, of this rabbi, who we're going to see, his name was Rabbi Asher Lemel, and they said, you're wrong. You can't tell a potential convert, especially a convert who had milah, to desecrate the Shabbos. And all the Sephardic rabbis, led by Rav Agan, disagreed with him, and they cried out about this psak, and they said, this potential ger has to keep the Shabbos. That was the dilemma. So Rav Asher Lemel didn't know what to do. And by the way, this story is recorded by a descendant of Rav Shmuel Salant. I had this chus when we were by Har HaZeisim, we visited the kever of Rav Shmuel Salant, And one of Shmuel Salant's descendants is Rabbi Chil Michal Tikachinsky. And Rabbi Chil Michal records this story. And he says Rav Asher Lemel was starting to get very nervous because nobody agreed with his psak that this potential ger should be Mechalo Shabbos. So he wrote a letter to two Gedolim in the time. First he wrote a letter to Rav Shmuel Salant, who was in Warsaw. And then he wrote a letter to the chief rabbi of Altona, who was the Aruch Lener, Rav Yaakov Ettlinger. And they both wrote to Rav Asher Lemel, B'mechilas kvoid toirascha harama. I'm sorry to tell you, but you're wrong, and you made a big mistake. Yeah, this potential ger is not allowed to be mechalel Shabbos. So Rav Chil Michal sort of records what did this rabbi hold? What did this Rav Asher Lemel hold that he told this potential ger to be mechalel Shabbos? So Rav Chil Michal records the whole story, and this Rav Asher Lemel writes how none of the rabbis agreed with him, and they said, whoever heard such a thing, that if you have a ger who was already circumcised, and he didn't have tevilah yet, then you're supposed to tell him to be mechalo Shabbos. Whoever heard such a thing? So Rav Asher Lemel said, well, you heard it here first. Please explain to me. He says, if you want, I could tell you a svara, and if you want, I could tell you a Gemara mefureshes that this ger is obligated to be mechalo Shabbos. Number one, he says, it's a svara. The svara is, we paskin like the Chachamim, that you're not a ger until you do milah and tefillah, which means before you do tefillah, you're a full-fledged goy. Now, what does the Gemara say in Sanhedrin Daf Nun Chesam Beis? Gemara says, goy sheshavas chayiv misa. If a goy keeps Shabbos, he's chayiv misa. By the way, where do we learn out that a goy sheshavas chayiv misa from? Where do we learn that from? We learn from the pasuk, Yom v'layla lo yishbaisu. Day and night, you cannot let it cease. Yom v'layla lo yishbaisu. And by the way, the Gemara says not only is a goy not allowed to keep Shabbos, he's not allowed to keep Monday. For a Gentile to rest 24 hours straight from Sunday night to Monday night is an Isser D'Oraisa. The Gemara says not only goy sheshavas chayiv misa for Saturday, for Sunday, for Monday, for Tuesday, any day, Gentile cannot spend the entire day without doing malacha. Now, is a goy chayiv misa for observing Shabbos? The Gemara says goy sheshavas chayiv misa. The Rambam learns that that's an exaggeration. The Rambam learns that even though a goy that violates any of the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach is chayiv misa b'dei Adam, however, if he violates Shabbos, Bezin will hit the goy, but Bezin will not kill the goy. But at the end of the day, it's an Isser D'Oraisa for a convert, for a goy, to keep the Shabbos. So says Rabbi Asher Lemel, I don't understand. We paskin that ger shemol v'loy taval is a goy gomor, and a goy is not allowed to keep Shabbos. So how could anybody in a clear conscience say that this goy has to keep the Shabbos? And l'chayra, what I'm saying is absolutely correct. We all know that one major distinction between a ger, between a goy and a Jew, is whether you're allowed to eat an animal that's mifar chesas. You know what mifar chesas is? You shech the animal, and the animal's shechted, but is alive. It's still thrashing about. Can a Jew eat an animal that is shechted and is mifar chesas? Absolutely yes. Can a goy eat an animal? No, because it's not dead. So a goy is not allowed to eat Ever Menachai. A Jew is not allowed to eat an animal that's not shechted. So this animal is shechted, but it's alive. So says Rabbi Asher Lemel, do you think that this ger who had milah and didn't have tefillah is allowed to eat an animal that's mifar chesas? Of course not. It would be an Isser D'Oraisa, we would kill him, right? A ger that did milah without tefillah, if he wants to eat an animal that's mifar chesas, he would not be allowed to be lenient. We would kill him for eating the animal. So the same way he can't be lenient to eat an animal that's mifar chesas, he should not be able to be lenient to do what? To eat, to observe the Shabbos. So, what?
How do you know that he can't eat? If you have milah, then he's not eating the chesas.
He's a ben noyach, and l'chayra.
But he's on his way.
He's on his way.
We still haven't answered the question.
But we, what?
We still haven't answered the question.
Well, we paskin ger shemol v'loy taval is a goy. So if he's a goy, the same way it seems like everybody says you can't eat the animal that's in Parshas, you should not be able to observe the Shabbos. Furthermore, we find in Shas that the Gemara says that a ger that has milah, that doesn't have tefillah, is a nachri l'chol davar. And the Gemara even says, by the way, if you remember on Mem Vav and Aleph, that there was a certain guy who the father was a ger, shemol v'loy taval. The woman was a Jewish woman, and Rabbi Yochanan paskin that in Rabbi Yochanan's opinion, a goy that marries a Jewish woman, the children are mamzerim. We don't paskin that way, but that's what Rabbi Yochanan paskins. Rabbi Yochanan said that a ger shemol v'loy taval that married a Jewish woman is considered the child's a mamzer. So you see, milah without tefillah is nothing. So milah without tefillah is not anything. How could anybody say that this ger shemol v'loy taval should observe Shabbos? This was the argument of Rabbi Asher Lemel. He feels that nobody got it right. He's the only one who saw it clearly. And honestly, between me and you, I would agree with him, Yisvara. Very nice, he had a milah. Very nice, he could have had the best smile in the world, whoever you think that is. But he didn't go to the mikveh, he didn't go to the mikveh. He's a guy. If he's a guy, can't keep Shabbos. I think I would have agreed with that psak. Comes Rav Shmuel of Salant, and he says, in his opinion, Rav Asher Lemel made a mistake, primarily based on the svara of the Rashba. Listen carefully. The Rashba wanted to know. The pasuk says, "Toishav v'sachir lo yoichabay," that a toishav and a sachir cannot eat the korban pesach. Says the Gemara in Ayin Aleph. Who is the pasuk excluding when it says toishav v'sachir lo yoichabay? Rabbi Kiva says it's excluding someone who has milah without tevilah. Yeah, Azriel, you hear? That it's coming to exclude someone who has milah without tevilah. Now, the Rashba asks, why would I need a pasuk to exclude someone who has milah without tefillah? But someone who has milah without tefillah is not Jewish. I don't need a pasuk to exclude them. The Rashba is mechadesh, even though they need tefillah. But the Rashba says, nichnas kfar hischil v'nichnas ktsas b'das Yehudis she'enoi tzarech ela tefillah. They already began and entered the Jewish religion that all they need is tefillah. So the Rashba is mechadesh, that once a person has milah without tefillah, you would have thought they could eat from the korban pesach, and I need a pasuk that says they can't eat from the korban pesach. Says Rav Shmuel Salant, that means you would have thought milah without tefillah renders you capable to eat the korban pesach, and I have a pasuk that says in fact you can't. But do I have a pasuk that says that if you have milah without tefillah you can't keep Shabbos? The same way I would have thought if you have milah without tefillah, you could have eaten from the korban pesach. I also would have thought if you have milah without tefillah, you could keep Shabbos. And I happen to have a pasuk that no, if you have milah without tefillah, you can't eat from the korban pesach. But I don't have a pasuk that if you have milah without tefillah, you can't keep Shabbos. So the havamina that I would have had by korban pesach, and is only uprooted because I have a pasuk that you don't bring the korban pesach if you have milah without tefillah, we would apply to Shabbos that milah without tefillah, you could keep the Shabbos based on the Rashba. You hear Rav Shmuel Salant's argument? Shmuel Salant is saying the Rashba learns that the reason I needed a pasuk by korban pesach is because I would have thought that since milah is makes you enter the Jewish fold to some extent, I would have thought you could eat from the korban pesach. So by the same token, maybe I would have thought you could keep Shabbos if you have milah without tefillah. And the only reason if you have milah without tefillah you can't eat from the korban pesach is because I have exeris hakasuv of toishav v'sachir lo yoichabay. But I don't have exeris hakasuv by Shabbos. So that means I would have thought you could keep Shabbos with milah, and I have no pasuk that's saying you can't keep Shabbos by someone who has milah without tefillah. And therefore, says Rav Shmuel Salant, Rav Asher Lemel was incorrect in paskening that this ger has to desecrate the Shabbos. Then Rav Shmuel Salant offers another reason why this partial convert should have kept Shabbos. He says, what is the status of someone who has milah without tefillah, and then he wants to retract? Like this. Here you have a guy, his name is Jim. So we give Jim a milah. He's not yet ready to go to the mikvah. Then Jim says, you know what? Tell me some of the halachas. So we tell him, hey pal, you can't talk by chazar sashatz. He says, really? You're telling me I can't become a Jew if I talk by chazar sashatz? I say, yeah. I said, no thanks. Let's say he wants to retract. Could he retract, or he's a Jew? He's allowed to retract. He could retract because he's not Jewish yet. He only had milah, he didn't have tefillah. Says Rav Shmuel Salant, you know what he's like? Let's say you say to a woman, hey lady, I'm marrying you in 30 days. And the guy's thinking, let me see if she knows how to make cholent or not. And then he has her cholent the first week. It tastes like, tastes like rotten applesauce on a good day. He says, let me give her one more shot. It's horrendous. It's terrible. Does he need a get? Or could he say, hey, lady, see you later. This ain't going to work out. There's no commitment. He said, I'm going to marry you in 30 days. So the same way, if you tell a woman, I'm going to marry you in 30 days, you could retract without a get. If someone does milah without tefillah, they could retract on the geros, and they were never a Jew. And what if they decide, you know what? I do want to become a Jew. I won't talk by chazar sashatz. Fine. They have to go through the geros again. They had milah, they have to do hatafas dam bris. So in other words, says Rav Shmuel Salant, what's going to happen if somebody sees this ger who had milah without tefillah, and then the rabbi says, by the way, it's Shabbos and you didn't have tefillah yet, you got to desecrate the Shabbos. People are going to think he desecrated the Shabbos. And then on Tuesday he went to the mikvah, and he didn't have hatafas dam bris. So people are going to think that if you retract on a geros, all you need to do is go to the mikvah and you don't have to do the milah again. And that's not true. You do have to do the milah again. Now, this guy really doesn't have to do the milah again. Why? Because we told him to desecrate the Shabbos since he doesn't have tefillah. But people are not going to know that. And since people are not going to know that, they're going to think mistakenly that the halacha is that if someone who has milah without tefillah and then desecrates the Shabbos, then if they want to become a Jew, they could just go to the mikvah and they don't have to do milah again. And says Rabbi Shmuel Salant, there's so many areas of halacha where because we're concerned of what people are going to think, we change the halacha accordingly. And therefore, says Rabbi Shmuel Salant, in this case of a guy who has milah without tefillah, and then he doesn't know what to do on Shabbos, heaven forbid to tell him to desecrate the Shabbos. Number one, because of the svara of the Rashba, that milah without tefillah enters you into the fold of Judaism to a certain extent, at least to be able to keep the Shabbos. And number two, if you're going to desecrate the Shabbos, it looks like you're retracting on the geros. And if you're retracting on the geros, then you can't just go to the mikvah after. You're going to have hatafas dam bris. And even though this guy is not really retracting, he's just listening to our advice because we're telling him to desecrate the Shabbos because he didn't have tefillah yet, but people are not going to know that. And therefore, for these two reasons, Rav Shmuel Salant paskind that we are required to tell this prospective ger that he's obligated to keep the Shabbos. By the way, in the Sofer Torah of Shmuel Salant, he brings that this question happened again. It repeated itself about 30 years later, where two Arelim came in front of the Bezdin of the Sfardim, and they weren't toivel, and their milah did not heal yet, and they wanted to know, what should we do? Are we allowed to keep the Shabbos, or do we have to desecrate the Shabbos? And Rav Shmuel Salant said, by the way, I remember, basically this story happened 30 years ago, and Rav Asher Lemel told the ger to desecrate the Shabbos, and he was wrong. The halacha is you have to keep the Shabbos for the following two reasons. Number one, the Rashba, namely, once you have milah, you enter the fold of Judaism to some extent, and therefore you have to at least keep the Shabbos. And number two, Because if you're going to desecrate the Shabbos, it looks like you're retracting on the Geros, and if you retract on the Geros, you would have to do Hatafas Dam Bris again. And then the Rav Shmuel Salant makes the following Kavachomer. If someone who had Mila without Tevila, there's a pasuk that says he can't eat from the Karm Pesach. Let's say I wouldn't have a pasuk that he can't eat from the Karm Pesach. I would think he could. Now, what's the punishment of someone who's not Jewish and eats from the Karm Pesach? V'chol zar lo yoichal ba yischayev kares. And even so, this person who has Mila without Tvila, I would have thought he's supposed to eat from the Karm Pesach, even though he's tampering with something very serious, potentially a chiv kares. But we say no. You had Mila that renders you enough of a Jew that you need to eat the Karm Pesach had it not been for a pasuk of Toisha v'sachar lo yechabai. So says Rav Shmuel Salant, if I even would have thought you could eat the Karm Pesach, which has a chi of Misa because you have Mila, certainly you should be able to keep the Shabbos, which does not have such a severe punishment for someone who is not Jewish for keeping the Shabbos. As we said, the Rambam says someone who keeps the Shabbos inappropriately is not chayiv misa. So if you would even eat a Karban Pesach without Tevila, certainly you should keep the Shabbos. That was the psak of Rav Shmuel Salant, both in 1848 and in 1878. Good point. You want to say we should be able to prove that you don't need tevila for achilas Karm Pesach because the Jews in the Midbar, l'chayra, they did not have tevila when they ate the Karm Pesach. Okay, that's a very important point. We're going to come to the tshuva of the Aruch LaNer, and the Aruch LaNer makes a similar point. Please take a look at number 5. This shaila was brought to the Shailas Tshuvas Binyan Sion. The Shailas Tshuvas Binyan Sion is Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger. Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger was the rabbi in Altona, and he received a letter from Rav Asher Lemel. And Rav Asher Lemel said, look, I really feel that since this convert does not have Tvila, he's a guy, and therefore he shouldn't be allowed to keep Shabbos. And the Aruch LaNer says, look, I heard that nobody wanted to be makabel your psak. Nobody wanted to accept your psak. So I did a little research. And what I discovered was there is no bezdin in the world that if a ger did mila and did not do tefillah, the bezdin is going to tell the prospective ger, hey, you need to desecrate the Shabbos. There's no such thing. It never happened. There's no court in the world that tells the ger that didn't go to the mikvah, he needs to desecrate the Shabbos. Says the Aruch LaNer, I'm not sure what the source is. It could just be a svara yeshara. And here's the svara. We know that when somebody gets a circumcision, it's called a bris. What does a bris mean, Azriel?
Circumcision.
What does a bris mean? What does the word bris mean? Covenant. A treaty. When someone has a bris milah, they have a covenant with God. In fact, the Gemara says in Shabbos, when a ger has a milah, you make a bracha, koreis habris. Well, Shabbos is also a bris between us and God. Does it make any sense to say that a convert who has milah and enters one covenant with God should then be obligated to break and annul the other covenant of Shabbos? That doesn't make any sense. It's just counterintuitive. Once you're entering the covenant, you should have to keep the covenant. What's the seichel of, you're getting the milah, so the first thing you need to do when you get the milah is break Shabbos. That doesn't make any sense. If you're entering the fold, you're entering the fold. If you're not entering, you're not entering the fold. Sometimes you need to just use a little straight thinking, a little common sense. Says the Aruch LaNer, it is not mistaber that when somebody enters the covenant of milah, they should have to break the covenant of Shabbos. That's just not logical. Furthermore, says the Aruch LaNer, what Rabbi Yitzchak says? Rabbi Yitzchak says the following very good svara. He says, in my opinion, says the Aruch LaNer, I would answer Tosfos' question different than Tosfos based on Rabbi Yitzchak's svara. Tosfos wanted to know, Why do I need a pasuk to say that someone who has Mila without Tevila is not allowed to eat the Karban Pesach? Why would I think he eats the Karban Pesach? He's a full-fledged guy. Says the Aruch LaNer, I'll tell you why I would have thought he eats the Karban Pesach. Because even though regarding every other mitzvah in the Torah, he's a full-fledged guy, L'gabe Karban Pesach, all you need is Mila. Where do we see that for Karban Pesach, all you need is Mila? The Jews, in the first Karban Pesach they ever ate, they had Mila, they didn't have Tvila. So you see that in order to eat a Karban Pesach, all you need is Mila. So it says, I have a very simple answer to Tosfos' question. Tosfos wants to know, why do I need a pasuk that if someone has Mila without Tvila, you can't eat from the Karban Pesach? But he's a guy, why would you think you could? You know what I would think you could? Because the Jews in the desert, in the wilderness of Sinai, the Israelites partook of the Paschal offering with just circumcision and without immersion. So you think that when it comes to Karban Pesach, all you need is Mila without Tefillah. That's why I need a pasuk. But then it comes out that I have a special pasuk that if someone just has Mila without Tefillah, they can't eat from the Karban Pesach. But I don't have a special pasuk that if someone who has Mila without Tefillah, they can't keep Shabbos. And here's the whopper of the night. The first whopper. The second whopper, we'll see if we could get Mendy to hear. Mendy will be very happy after he hears this. The first whopper is like this. When did the Jews get Shabbos? When did the Israelites? They were what? Right. They're commanded in Mara. Ozmi Sinai nitztavu. Before Sinai. Sham sam chayku mishpat v'sham yisrael. The Jews got Shabbos at Mara. Before they got the Torah. Now historically, when did the Jews circumcise? The night of Mitzrayim. When did they go to the mikvah? Har Sinai. So when did they get Shabbos? Mara. So okay, we have a tradition. They kept Shabbos in Mitzrayim, but they were given Shabbos at Mara. At that point, they had Mila without Tvila. Says the Aruch LaNer. So we should learn out from there that even though for a Karban Pesach we have a pasuk, if you have Mila without Tefillah, you can't eat from the Karban Pesach, but I have the greatest precedent in the world that if you have Mila without Tefillah, you could keep Shabbos. Namely, the Jews were given Shabbos at Mara, even though they didn't go to the mikvah. So you want to know, Rav Asher Lemel, you're telling me that this potential ger must desecrate Shabbos because he is Mila without Tefillah and he's a guy. I will tell you that Shabbos is different than any other mitzvah. All the other mitzvahs, you need to be a full-fledged Jew and go to the mikvah to be Mekayim. But not Shabbos. Well, why would Shabbos be different? Because historically, Shabbos was given to the Jewish people when they only had Mila and they didn't have Tefillah at Mara. And therefore, says the Aruch LaNer, why would that be? Let's think for a moment. Why would it be that to be a full-fledged ger, you need mikvah, but for Shabbos, all you need is Mila? He would say, either it's Xeris HaKasav that regarding Shabbos, you're no longer a guy once you have Mila, or the two covenants go together. Once you enter the covenant, namely bris, you need to keep the covenant Shabbos. And therefore the Aruch LaNer says, Rav Asher Lemel, you're a great rabbi, but when it came to this issue, you made a mistake. You should not have told the guy to desecrate Shabbos. Either, since we see from Marad that the Jews were commanded on Shabbos when they just had Mila, so it comes out, Shabbos is dependent on Mila and not Tefillah. Now I'm going to share with you my favorite Avnei Nezer, one of my favorite Marmakoimis I ever came across. I saw this 17 years ago, and I never had an opportunity to say it in a shiur. It just never came about. Remember when I first started giving Shiurim, so I used to give one shiur a year. It took me a whole year to prepare the shiur. And then started, getting the process down a little bit. But I remember I saw this a very long time ago, and it's an incredible Avnei Nezer. The Avnei Nezer says, almost exactly like the Aruch LaNer, that it would seem that from the fact that the Jews the Jews were given Shabbos at Mara, even though they had Mila and not Tvila, that Shabbos is dependent on Mila and it's Tvila is not necessary. But says the Aruch LaNer, but maybe you'll ask, that was an aberration, that was different. You can't learn that from the Jews in the desert. I'll bring you a raya. Says the Avnei Nezer, even when the Jews ate the first Korban Pesach, what did they have? Did they have tefillah? No, they also didn't have milah. Avnei Nezer says they didn't have milah until later that night. So why don't we learn out from there that you don't need anything to eat the Korban Pesach? It must be it was a Hirah Shah, and you can't learn out from the Jews in the desert. So maybe don't say, well, they were given Shabbos at Mara, so maybe all you need is milah without tefillah. And anyway, if all you need for Shabbos is milah, so then why didn't God in Egypt give the Jewish people Shabbos as soon as they did the milah? So the Avnei Nezer says a mind-boggling thing. He says, if you look in the Zohar HaKadosh, we know there are two parts of milah. There's the circumcision, you cut the foreskin, then you take the foreskin and you pull it back and you uncover the corona. That's Puriya. He says, well, who does that? Jewish people do that, the Israelites, and the descendants of. We do that. Jews everywhere, observant Jews do milah and Priya. Milah the Jews did in Egypt. When were we given Priya? Says the Zohar, Priya were given at Mara. At the very same time we were given Shabbos. Says the Avnei Nezer, according to the Zohar, it comes out so compelling that Shabbos is different than all other mitzvahs in the Torah. All other mitzvahs in the Torah, you need milah and tefillah. But Shabbos clearly is utterly dependent on milah. Because so you say, why weren't we given Shabbos in Mitzrayim? Because we didn't have the whole mitzvah of milah in Mitzrayim. We only had milah. But the Priya wasn't given until Mara. As soon as we got the Priya, we got Shabbos. So says the Avnei Nezer, according to the Zohar, it comes out, Shabbos is not dependent on being Jewish, Shabbos is dependent on Bris Milah. Why? Either like the Aruch LaNer said, either it's Exeres HaKasav, or because the two covenants go together. But according to the Zohar, it is so compelling, the dependency of Shabbos on milah, because according to the Zohar, they didn't have Priya in Mitzrayim, they had Priya at Mara, and at the very same moment Hashem gave us Shabbos. Says the Avnei Nezer, so why didn't any of the Rishonim, not Toises, not the Rashba, learn the Sugya in Yavamis, that even though you need milah and tefillah to be a Jew, but for Korban Pesach and Shabbos, you don't need tefillah, you only need milah. Says Avnei Nezer, you know why nobody thought of my pshat? Because Tosfos never saw the Zohar HaKadosh. And the Rashba never saw the Zohar HaKadosh. So you say, how could that be? The Zohar was written by the Rashbi and probably by much later Amoraim as well. Yeah, but we know that historically the Zohar was not revealed until after the times of the Rishonim and times of the early Achronim. The Rishonim did not have the Zohar. So since they didn't have the Zohar, they didn't know this tidbit that the Priya was given at Mara, so therefore they couldn't establish a connection between Milah and Shabbos because the Milah was in Egypt and Shabbos was at Mara. But now that we know that Milah was in Egypt, Priya was at Mara, and at the same time was Shabbos, now that we know this tidbit from the Zohar, we see that Milah and Shabbos go hand in hand, and we could say Shabbos is different from any other mitzvah in the Torah. Shabbos is dependent on Bris Milah. So,
Would they have news that also?
where? Who? What?
Before Shabbos.
Would they need Hatafas Dam Bris? No. The Jews? No, and I'll tell you a bigger chiddush that the Rashba says. Shevet Levi did Milah in Mitzrayim. Did they need to do Hatafas Dam Bris again when they left Mitzrayim, when Hashem gave the mitzvah to Klal Yisrael? The Rashba said no. Once you do Milah, l'shem entering Hashem's bris, even if you're not commanded, you don't have to repeat any of the steps. That's another Rashba. So you don't have to do Hatavas Dam Bris. So Merva Aboisai, before we come to the real whopper of the evening, it comes out that while this ger, who by the way came from Morocco, and he was not able to have tefillah because his milah was not healed, while Rav Asher Anshel told him to be Machalo Shabbos because he held milah without tefillah is not a good gerus, and that's what this ger did. We have three svaras why, in fact, Shabbos should have been kept for a ger that has milah without tefillah. Number one, the Rashba, that even though you're not a full ger unless you have Mila and Tefillah, you already begin to enter Judaism a little bit with the mitzvah of Mila, and therefore you can't say he should be Mechalo Shabbos. Number two, if you're going to be Mechalo Shabbos, it looks like you're retracting on the original Geros, and if you're retracting the original Geros, then really you should need Hatafas Dam Bris again, and it's not going to look good. And number three, Shabbos is different than any other mitzvah in the Torah. Shabbos is not dependent on being Jewish. Shabbos is dependent on Bris Milah. By the way, before we come to the grand finale, I want to tell you a Rabbi Yosef Engel. Rabbi Yosef Engel writes in his Chedushim on Yevamis that he finds it funny that there are two ingredients in conversion, Mila and Tefillah. Is it that, you need to get to two, and one without the other is not going to get you there, or is it that they're doing different things? So Rabbi Yosef Engel says that there are two steps in becoming a Jew. For example, Mendy, you ever use Sefer HaYetzirah? Not recently, right? Not since I haven't been around as much, right? So, what's halach if somebody creates, in some places they need help with a minyan. So you have 9 people. Right? It used to happen. Remember in the good old days? So what do? So the Svarim discussed, you create somebody with the Sefer Yetzirah. Is a Goylam created with the Sefer Yetzirah? Is he Jewish? Not Jewish. Is he a Goy? Not a Goy. So what is he? So you see, you could be not Goy, not non-Gentile, and not Jewish. Not everyone who's not a Gentile is a Jew. So Yosef Engel says, Mila removes your status of a Goy, but you're still not entering the status of being a Jew. Tvila enters you into the fold of being Jewish, so it comes out, Goy sheshavas chayiv misa. But if you have Mila, you're not a Goy. You're not a Jew either, but you're not a Goy. What? You're a Goy lam, right? That's fine. Anyway, so now we come to the highlight of the year. If you came for this year, this is Oyam B'Noir. This is a historical episode that's recorded in by a history book about the Chasam Sofer called Zichroin L'Moshe. That it was told to Rabbi Yosef HaKoyen Schwartz by Reb Zisman of Kashoy, that he heard from his good friend Rabbi Yaakov Frankfurter, that in the times of the Chasam Sofer there was a little city. What's a good name of a city near Pressburg?
Frankfurt.
A little city. A little city. What? Serie. In Serie, we're protecting the names of the innocent, so we're picking a fictitious name. A guy came, and the guy said, I want to convert. So the rabbi said, no problem, you have to accept the mitzvahs. And then they gave the rabbi gave him a circumcision. Now this rabbi was not the most expert moyel, but he did the job. It's not like a rabbi living in the big city where he's doing it every Monday and Thursday. He did it once every 7 years. The rabbi didn't do such a slick job, as we would say. And the guy was in such pain, and he had to be admitted in the hospital, and his life was in danger. And this became a libel, where people said the rabbi tried to kill the Gentile. And the moyel was in big trouble. So the rabbi goes to the Chasam Sofer, and Chasam Sofer says, you did what? You in your little city in Sarie, you took a ger and you circumcised a ger? This is not something, it's not amateur hour. Circumcision, not amateur hour. Either you know what you're doing, you're not. Chasam Sofer was very upset, but he said, okay, it's done already. There's only one way out. Your whole city is in danger. The whole world is all of Klal Yisrael is in danger. This is what you're going to have to do, Rabbi. You're going to call the moyel, you're going to pick the moyel up in your wagon. You're going to pick up the guy in the wagon. And you're going to tell the guy you're taking him to a famous doctor. And you're going to be riding along the Danube River. And you're going to make a sharp right turn straight into the river, and you're going to commit suicide. And this way, people are going to understand that you didn't try to kill the guy, because if you try to kill the guy, why would you have been trying to help the guy by taking him to the doctor? So you, the moyal, both of you guys got to go into the wagon. You got to bring the guy into the wagon, drive him to the icy river, and you need to plunge to an icy death. And that's it. You got to give up your life. So the rabbi said, if that's what I have to do to save Klal, so that's what I'm going to do. He goes to the moyal. The moyal says, I'm going to do that also. They knock on the guy's house. The guy's, he's half dead. He says, come on, there's a good doctor. He says, is it a Jewish doctor? Yeah, it's a Jewish doctor. Jumps in the wagon. They get to the Danube River, and they're about to make a right turn into the icy river. All of a sudden, they see there's a rabbi standing there with a long white beard. And he says, what are you doing? You out of your mind? Sorry, we just lost control. What's going on here? Who's in here? He said, whatever. The rabbi doesn't let up. He says, tell me, what's happening? He says, we have a chayla in the back. What's wrong? He has a botched milah. Okay. You guys are mishugoyim. You're going to a doctor? A doctor? What's the doctor going to do? Once you botch the milah, there's nothing you could do. I happen to have some water in my back pocket. I'm going to pour it on the guy, and he's going to have refuah shalema. And he pours it on the guy, and the guy snaps out of it, and he has a refuah shalema. And the rabbi and the moyal head straight off to Chasam Sofer. And the Chasam Sofer says, I knew you'd be coming back to me. You needed to have Eliyahu Malach HaBris send a refuah to this guy. And the truth is, says the Chasam Sofer, I also wanted to see him. But you could only see him if you're willing to be Moiser Nefesh Al Kiddush Hashem. And because you followed my advice, which I knew you would, Eliyahu came and he healed the guy. Don't ever do that again. That's the story recorded. You see the godless of the Chasam Sofer, that he knew how to achieve Gilui Eliyahu, how to bring refuah to this guy, and how to save the Jewish people. That's the story. So who discusses the story? Obviously, Rabbi Yitzchak Zilberstein in the Chashukei Chemed. And Rabbi Yitzchak Zilberstein asks one simple question. The rabbi wants to give up his life to save the Jewish people. You're allowed to do that. The Gemara in Tainus talks about a situation where the king wanted to kill out the city because his daughter was killed. So Puppis and Lulianus, they gave up their life and they committed suicide to save the Jewish people. Are you allowed to commit suicide to save the Jewish people? Avada and Avada, you're allowed to. Are you allowed to kill someone to save other Jews? Absolutely not. We know the Gemara says that if the Goyim say, either give us one of you or we're going to kill everyone, you're not allowed to give one of them. So ask Rabbi Yitzchak Zilberstein, the fact that the rabbi wants to turn right into the Danube River and kill himself, he's allowed to do that. The fact that the Moyal wants to commit suicide, he's allowed to do that. But how are they allowed to kill the guy? So you say, what do you mean? It's not an Israeli. But he had milah without tefillah. And according to the Rashba, if you have milah without tefillah, you already entered nichnas ktsas into the fold, and you've already become a Jew to a certain extent, and you have Kedushas Yisrael. Says Rabbi Yitzchak Zilberstein, what's the halacha of someone who had milah without tefillah, and his life is on the line? Are you allowed to desecrate the Shabbos to save their life? So Rabbi Yitzchak Zilberstein quotes the Chelkas Yoav, that since that he has Kedushas Yisrael, you're allowed to desecrate Shabbos to save their life. Ooh, you're allowed to so that means, if you're allowed to desecrate Shabbos to save your life, that means, if you even have to desecrate Shabbos to save their life, then how could you kill them to save other Jews? That's the kasha of Rabbi Yitzchak Zilberstein. And I would answer very simply. Who's the question on them? The Chasam Sofer knew that they wouldn't be killing him because the Chasam Sofer knew what the outcome of the story was. I guess the question though is, how are they allowed to listen to the Chasam Sofer? I don't know, when the Chasam Sofer tells you to do it, you do it. When the Chasam Sofer tells you to jump, you jump. But I guess that's not right. In other words, it would seem that they should not have listened to the psak of the Chasam Sofer. So Rabbi Yitzchak Zilberstein says as follows. even though you're not allowed to kill someone to save other people's lives, but if that someone only has chayesha, if that someone anyway doesn't have a prospect of living indefinitely, then you may be allowed to take their life to save others. This guy, his mila was so botched that his prognosis for living wasn't good anyway. So he was only capable of living chayesha, so they were allowed to, so to speak, kill him to save other Jews. But Mav Rabbi Sai, this is the great controversy of 1848 and the riveting story of the Chasam Sofer, who actually recommended to a rabbi and a moyal that they commit suicide to save the rest of the Jewish people. And this is based on the svara of the Rashba, that it does seem that even though one is not a ger, if they only have Mila without Tevila, nevertheless, there is some element of Judaism that has been created through Mila even without Tevila. According to Rabbi Yosef Engel, it means the status of Gentileness has been taken away, but the status of Judaism has not begun. Plus, Rabbi Shmuel Salant says if you're going to desecrate the Shabbos after Mila, it looks like you're retracting. And one of the most interesting svaras we saw is that it seems that Shabbos is very dependent on Bris Milah, either because they're both covenants, or because Klal Yisrael at Mara received Shabbos with Milah, and even though they did not receive the Tefillah yet. Okay, but Mar Rabbi Sai, if you do know any converts, it is recommended that they go to the mikvah before Shabbos. They could go to, right over here, to the Shtibel, or they could go to Eish Kodesh, but it is recommended that they go to the mikvah before the Shabbos so they don't have to get involved in such a heated controversy. Rabbi say, have a great night.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.